The reason I talked about Apple TV because I feel like this platform is really underrated. Like most of us already know most of the tools to develop for this particular platform, but Focus is kind of the missing tool in our toolbox. Once you know about it, you could actually develop nice apps for Apple TV. Another reason is most of us today have used a smart TV, be it Android, Samsung, LG, whatever, and all of them have this concept of focus. So it's very easy to understand from that perspective. From the perspective of like macOS, you could always, like if focus doesn't work or doesn't flow as you want it to, you could always get a little bit frustrated and use your trackpad, but you can't do that in terms of TV. Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Pradnya, and today I'm going to talk about getting focus right on Apple platforms. So one of the key reasons for existence of this technology is like the absence of pointer on platforms like Apple TV or Vision Pro. Another reason is you using pointer-free input methods like keyboard on your iPad or keyboard on your macOS. You could also use the digital crown on Apple Watches, or you could also use your game controller to control your TVs. And when you actually use a pointer, the coordinates of that particular pointer are used by the operating system to determine which part of the app you're interacting with. But when you don't have that, focus is the missing piece that kind of helps there. And mostly, a focus view is always presented with some kind of a special emphasis. As you can see, like on Apple TV, it lifts itself above the plane from other components, so you can tell like which particular cell is in focus. And that is actually also true for other things, like on watchOS, if a element is in focus, it would receive like a green border. On macOS and iPadOS, you could see either accent colored border, which is like the blue one here, or you could see like a faint background on things that are focused. Yeah, hopefully it's visible. And of course, in case of iOS, we've already seen this like millions of times. Getting a text field receiving focus will bring up the keyboard or the picker or whatever it is that you're dealing with. And so yeah, to summarize, focus acts as a cursor to kind of make user understand where their input is going. And it also reminds the user, like in a complex interface, where which part of the app they're interacting with. As for example, on iPads, like is it the sidebar or is it the main view? So yeah, in complex visual layouts, it also plays like a different kind of role. And yeah, so moving on to which elements can be focusable. So there could be different kinds of elements that can be focusable. Usually the things that are interactive, you can assume by default are focusable, like buttons, text fields, special kinds of buttons like segment control is also a button, search fields is also a text field. On UIKit, some special things like collection view cells and table view cells are actually also focusable by default. And actually, using some APIs, you can make almost anything focusable, which is very interesting. For example, here it's a vertical stack of an image and a text. And by adding this kind of focusable modifier, you can make this particular guy focusable, right? And you can actually use this same thing and make something not focusable. So for example, if for some reason this text field, you don't want it to receive focus, you can still use it and pass the boolean to false. Pass the condition to false. And let's look at the official documentation. So that's how it looks like. Interesting thing about this one is it is very new on iOS and iPadOS 17 only, but it's been there for a while on macOS and tvOS. So yeah, probably on other platforms it's going to take a while to adopt this one. But we did this. What happens when this particular VStack is focusable? Well, actually, nothing happens because you haven't really added that effect. Like, how can user tell it has received focus? So, in practice, like I've used my Apple TV remote or whatever it is, and I've moved focus to that particular element. Well, you haven't really done anything to make it look different, so nothing is going to happen. And to fix that, you're going to have to add some kind of effect and give it like a special treatment if it's focused, and then if it's not focused, like, yeah, add some background color or something that tells user it's in focus. And that kind of effect, like something like that, is actually by default for buttons and text fields, but other stuff doesn't get that. So you will have to do that by yourself. That's one of the caveats of using that modifier. Another thing is if you want to customize the effect, that's not very straightforward. So to do that, you're gonna have to disable the default effect. For example, if I wanted a blue black background instead of white when this particular car is in focus, you would have to do that. And to customize focus effects, you're gonna have to learn a little bit more APIs. So let's come back to that in some time. And let's instead look at a sample application. So this is a sample app I created for my 2-year-old son. He's obsessed with vehicles, so I was like, oh well, naturally I should create an application for that. And yeah, so it's like a very simple app, something that we can both enjoy playing together. And instead of using like a iOS app or developing an iOS app, I decided to create a tvOS app. I just want to take advantage of the big screen that we have on there, and then it's also a touch-free interface, so that helps as well. And this particular app is exactly one feature. At this point, it's if you tap on a vehicle, it gets added to your track. So what happens is there is like 2 different interactions going on here. So when I focus on a car, it actually gets added it gets highlighted with the white background. But when I tap on it using like the remote, it gets added to the track. So focus and selection are actually 2 different interactions, and even if it's like very obvious, it's an important point to consider while building user interactions on TVs. And it can be slightly confusing because sometimes focus and selection can mean same thing. For example, imagine a segment control with an on and off switch. In that case, when you focus on the on or the off part, it actually also gets selected. So it can be the same thing in some contexts. So yeah, context really matters. But moving on to focus interactions, I just wanted to look at like your focus interaction in a little bit more depth. For example, here I'm just horizontally swiping on the remote, so it moves from left to right, kind of obvious. But again, whatever you do, it does not move diagonally, and that's very important to understand, especially when you get bugs. Like that's where like the key stuff comes from. And then when I swipe vertically, it's going to move exactly in vertical directions, no matter what. And all of these cells, by the way, are buttons, so they get this kind of effect by default. Focus is also by default. Focus on adjacency basis is for free. So I didn't really use any special APIs to get here. So this is like a very basic SwiftUI app that you might as well build for iOS. And it's on Apple TV now, and it works perfectly. So yeah, it's very important to understand that focus by default works really well, and nothing's stopping you from creating an app on Apple TV. Really, there are some APIs that do special things, but as if you're developing basic interfaces, everything is out of box and for free. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, so as we add more features to this application, we're going to run into problems. Let's look at the first one. This is like a very interesting thing that happens mostly on big screens. And if you develop for Apple TV, this is probably the first issue you're going to run into. So what's happening here is when I swipe up from the yellow car to the reset button, the focus moves up as expected. Nothing wrong with that. But when I do that from this particular element, like focus kind of appears as stuck and it doesn't move past. And I would actually expect it to go to reset button because I don't want to like scroll all the way to the last vehicle and then swipe up. So something is wrong, and we don't want that to work that way. And the reason for that is the first thing that we saw before was focus working on adjacency basis, right? So when I swipe up from this particular vehicle, it's going to look for something there, and there's nothing. So the gesture fails, and it's like, oh, I'm stuck. And actually, you're not stuck. There is really nothing there, so it doesn't move there. But when you, of course, swipe up from here, reset button is exactly above it, so it works. So to fix that, what we're going to do is we're going to change the size of the target. So your target is right now the reset button, really small, and we're going to try and increase the target to this entire header, and that's it. That's the solution. This can be interpreted as an invisible focus guide that exists there, and it catches the focus. In SwiftUI terminology, it's called a focus section. So we are going to create a focus section here, and what focus section does is it actually transfers the focus to focusable elements inside the section. So there are two focusable elements, of course. Start button is disabled, so it moves on to reset button. But yeah, ideally it would move to start button if it was enabled. And here's the code for my header. So that's what the code looks like. We're going to, looking at the key part of the code, I've just added the focus section modifier to the entire horizontal stack, which is basically the horizontal stack of my text title and two buttons. And that's it, like that basically makes it work. One thing to note about this is obviously make sure when you use this modifier, the parent container is bigger than the target, otherwise it's not gonna work. Another thing is it's very common to create special containers for this. In my case, I had a ready-made header, which I could just make it as focus section, and it really works. But yeah, you can go ahead and create one container to just for focus sections, like that's really common. And yeah, favorite part, the demo. So focus now moves perfectly up and down, no issues whatsoever. And looking at the official documentation, yeah, nothing special in the documentation, does what it says. But important thing, it's not supported on iOS and iPadOS. And I'm guessing here that that's because this particular API only exists for big screens. You wouldn't really run into such issues on smaller screens. So I guess that's the reason, but we can't know for sure. All right, let's look at the second issue, a more interesting one. So to improve the engagement of my app, I'm trying to come up with new features, and this is what I'm calling the track preview feature. So while browsing around different vehicles, what if the track simultaneously updates and displays vehicles within dotted lines? We're calling it like track preview, and I think this is going to improve engagement of our app. It really encourages the user to browse around the vehicles, see how the vehicle looks like on the track. So I think it's kind of fun and just adds a different angle to the entire app. But thinking about the implementation, one first thing that comes across is now you need to know which vehicle is in focus at all times. So before this, we didn't really have to know which object is in focus. Right now, we're going to have to find a way to kind of expose the state of the focus, which is actually called focus state. So yeah, so we want to expose focus state of the app. And yeah, there are so many APIs to do that. But instead of getting overwhelmed with the list, just use the first one, which is the simplest one, and it's called Focus State API. So just looking at the documentation of it, in simpler words, this property is meant to access and also edit the changes in focused elements on your screen. So it works both ways. You can also access it, but if you set it to something, you can also manipulate focus in that way. Right, looking at the simple example first. So this is a VStack wrapped inside a button, as I said. And what I've done is there are two steps. First step is creating a dynamic property with focus state property wrapper, and it's Boolean, and using the .focus modifier with to bind that property here. So this is our way of instructing SwiftUI, like whenever this button is in focus, you set this property to true. And that's exactly how it works. So initially it's false, and whenever the element is in focus, it's going to turn into true. And this property, I like this property a lot because it's very versatile. You can use this to do different things. Like you can use this property to give special emphasis to your view because you get like dynamic updates since it's a state property. So let's come back to the question that we asked initially. So what if I want to change the background color when this element is in focus? I'm going to do two things. First thing is disable the default focus effect. So that's the focus effect disabled modifier. And the next thing is to switch the background color. So here I'm just using isFocused property and just switching it from blue to clear. And I'm also changing the scale a little bit. If you saw my demo earlier before, you could see like the focused buttons like slightly zoom in. So that's what I'm trying to achieve, like a similar effect. And that's what Apple even recommends, to keep things similar to the default interfaces so that users are used to that interaction and they know what happens when things are in focus, and then they can, it's like easy to understand and nobody's confused when they use your app. So this is a good approach, easy. You just add ternary conditions and ternary conditions and that's it. But there is another approach, which is, in my opinion, slightly more flexible, and that's using onChange modifier. So what you can do is add an onChange modifier on the isFocus property, and that is going to perform like call this closure on every single change. So in this case, that the focused property changes, this closure is called, and I can like animate it like that. Yeah, you could also change your view models in this closure. Usually like that's what I like to do. So whenever focus changes, if some of your view models are changing, something else changes, you want to do animations, like this is pretty much more flexible. So yeah, very easy to work with. So yeah, depending on what you're looking for, you could go with like one or the other approach. But moving on to our initial issue, just knowing if a button is in focus is not going to be enough. You want to know which vehicle is in focus. And for this exact reason, focus state actually also supports hashable types. So what I've done here is I've created a row of vehicles. And it's a simple for each loop in a horizontal stack. And I'm rendering all these buttons. And looking at the important part of the code, what I've done is I've changed the Boolean type to vehicle. So now this variable is of type vehicle. Note that it's an optional. It has to be an optional because if focus moves out of your view, it will be set to nil. And if you don't have it as an optional, your app is going to crash. So yeah, keep that in mind. And you use the focused modifier again to bind this property. This time you're going to have to supply a value. So I'm just going to use the same value from a for each loop. And this is our way of instructing SwiftUI. Set this property to this instance whenever this button is in focus. Because remember, it's in a loop. So this is called for every single button. So whenever that button comes in focus, you get that instance set to your object. So as expected, in action, it's going to be nil because none of the buttons are in focus. And whenever your button comes under focus, it's going to like change dynamically. And that's exactly what we're looking for. So yeah, that's great. So yeah, we now know which vehicle is in focus at all times. But unfortunately, we are not equipped to actually still implement the feature, and that's because I'm using modularization. As some people said in the talks before, oh, we should use modularization. Well, it's creating more problems because I have now 3 views here. So it's header view, track view, and grid view. And what we did just now, we just have focused vehicle in the grid view. So we don't really have it in track view, which is where we want to render it. And those of us who have used SwiftUI a lot, well, we have one solution that we always throw at these problems, and that's using bindings. So what you could do is you could take it out, put it in the super view, which is my play view here, and inject it as binding inside track view and grid view. And then whenever grid view updates the vehicle, track view also gets that update and it works. And while I have actually tried this approach, it works perfectly well. It's slightly bit more manual, I guess, and there has to be a better way, right? Because in the end, only one thing can be in focus at a time. So isn't there something like SwiftUI can do for us here and can like help us do it? And yes, the answer to all these questions is FocusedValue property wrapper. So this is a new one, and this basically is meant for observing values that are supplied by focused views. So it's a slightly more complicated approach, but it is more flexible, and in complex layouts, it really works well. This is supported from version 14, so no issues in using this. I think this is like a really good solution for most of your issues if you really want to know what particular thing is in focus at all times. But one issue is it only supports value types. So by definition, you can, if you have structs, great, good for you. This one is going to work. But let's come back to this problem and see what to do if you have observable objects instead. So yeah, creating and using focused values are very similar to custom environment objects if you've done that in SwiftUI before. But if you haven't, like, it's not that complicated. It's mostly all boilerplate code. So let's look at it like step by step. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to implement focused value key protocol, and you're going to define a key path. And the main intent is to define the type. The type is, of course, vehicle, so straightforward. And then the next step is to add a new property to focused values collection. Focused value collection can be thought of as a object of like an environment object, but for focus related stuff. So it's like a global thing that you can access from wherever you want, and we've added a new property here. So if in case you have navigation bars and your navigation items can be in focus, you add another property and say, oh, navigation item. So you could add, so this could be like a collection of focus related states. Right now we only have vehicles, so we only created like one property, and just provide getters and setters, use the struct we defined before. And yeah, that's it. It's pretty much boilerplate. And it is still an optional, so note it needs to be an optional because it will be nil at some point. And going back to current implementation, this is like the same implementation we did with focus state. So we're going to do two changes. One important one is to delete the focused value property because we don't need to store it anymore. Focused values is going to store it for us. This also means that we don't have to manage memories for this object, and that actually has pros and cons. So now SwiftUI is going to use its own memory to store our objects. So yeah, just something to note there. And then the next thing is using focused value modifier. So instead of the focus modifier we used before, we're going to use the focused value modifier. And then same thing, we're going to, it takes two arguments. First one is to give it the key path that we just defined before, and then the value. So the value has to be of type vehicle. So that's the one that we pass. And yeah, that's basically how we have now defined exposed focused value. So now it's out into the environment. Whoever wants to access it can access it using that particular value. So that's how we're going to deal with it. This is my track view. So track view is like an overlapping Z-stack of the road image, which is the track, and then we have a horizontal stack of vehicles again on top of it. Those are the vehicles that the user already added to track, and then we're going to append our preview to this particular stack. So to do that, first thing, create a dynamic property. So this is our way of telling SwiftUI, hey, I want to observe this. So please let me know whenever focused value for this key has changed. Note that I didn't specify the type here. I don't have to, because it's already defined as part of the key path. So SwiftUI knows what's the type of this variable. And next thing I do is to unwrap it because it's an optional. So if let, and then if it exists, then I render the vehicle view. This approach is really cool because this way we make sure if it's nil, it doesn't get rendered. So you don't see the track preview if focus moves out and there is no focused vehicle, it automatically is hidden, as in it's not rendered. So you don't have to take care of like hiding it and showing it. So yeah, that's makes things easy. And yeah, let's see how that works in action. I think it really looks cool, more engaging than before. And as we focus on different vehicles, the preview also gets rendered nicely and it's pretty instantaneous, so that's pretty cool. But coming back to this problem, it doesn't work for value types. If you have reference types, you can use this. But note that this is meant for observable objects. So if your focused views want to supply an observable object, you can use this. It's the exactly same way of focus value. But there is a catch, of course. It's only supported on 16 plus, which is, I'm sure, a bit difficult for us because of the minimum version requirements. So yeah, pros and cons. But if you still want to expose objects instead of value types, you could go back to the focus state approach that we saw initially, and it will work perfectly well, so no issues whatsoever. I would recommend that approach if you're using like, if you want to support like 16 and below, 15 and below. Right, and the last problem that we're going to see, when I launch the app, focus always goes to reset button. And there is a reason for this because Focus Engine actually, whenever a screen starts up or your app starts up, it's going to create a focus chain. So focus chain is like it starts from left to right. If you are locale, in the locale left to right, which is English or Italian, all of them start left to right. If it's Arabic, it's going to start in the other direction. So make sure you do your stuff accordingly. But the thing is that whenever the chain forms, the first thing in the chain is the one going to receive focus. So in our case, it's the reset button. And that's why whenever I start my app, my focus goes to reset button. But I don't want this. I want it to go to the first car, the first element, because let's face it, like who's going to use the button if there's nothing on the track, and I'm not even sure our users are going to get to the reset button. They just basically will scroll around the app with the cars. So yeah, how to change preferred focus on launch. There is few steps there. So this is, by the way, my play view. Play view is a vertical stack of the header, the track, and then the grid. So as we saw before, what I'm going to do is, first thing, define a namespace. So namespace, you can think of them as context. So this is in context of the entire play view, but I could define default focus in the context of a sidebar, for example, and then that's a different namespace. So in this namespace, I want to define the preferred default focus. So this namespace is, I will bind it to the entire play view because that's where I want to declare the default focus. And then the last thing is to use the modifier and then specify the namespace. What this will do is whenever your play view gets rendered, it's going to look for this particular declaration and it's going to be like, okay, let's the focus go to the grid. And obviously in the grid, first car is the first element. So if you follow the same left to right focus chain, the first one is going to get the focus. And that's exactly what happens. When I launch my app now, the first car gets the focus. Looking at the official documentation, it actually also takes in a Boolean condition, which is defaults to true as expected. But you could always pass a condition. If you want to conditionally manipulate focus, you could do that. Like if this is the case, then the focus goes here, if that not. So yeah, you could also pass in a condition, Boolean condition, and of course the namespace is required. And yeah, So I have talked a lot about Focus related to Apple TV, but actually in reality it's gaining a lot of traction on iPad and macOS. The reason I talked about Apple TV because I feel like this platform is really underrated. Like most of us already know most of the tools to develop for this particular platform, but Focus is kind of the missing tool in our toolbox. Once you know about it, you could actually develop nice apps for Apple TV. So I really wanted to, that's the reason I wanted to talk about it from that point of view. Another reason is most of us today have used a smart TV, be it Android, Samsung, LG, whatever, and all of them have this concept of focus. So it's very easy to understand from that perspective. From the perspective of like Mac OS, you could always, like if focus doesn't work or doesn't flow as you want it to, you could always get a little bit frustrated and use your trackpad, but you can't do that in terms of TV. So yeah, that's one of the reasons. But yeah, it's very relevant actually on iPad and macOS these days. Like supporting keyboard navigation on your Mac app is like something like a delight feature that you can provide your users. And all the APIs are common, so if you learn them, you can actually develop for whatever platform you wanted. VisionOS as well. I'm working on VisionOS these days, and the concept of focus is actually really relevant there because no pointer. So yeah, similar APIs that you can make use. And watchOS, obviously there's such a small screen size, you have to like use focus to kind of show user where their input is going, and digital ground is mostly the best way to provide input. So yeah, you're gonna have to use those APIs on watchOS as well. And iPhone with software keyboard, we already know that. But what I want to actually talk about was iPad, because iPad Focus is gaining a lot of traction, especially because actually it didn't exist before 15. So Apple introduced the concept of focus in iPadOS 15, which is relatively new, I would say, and since then they are really trying to push everybody to do that. So adding it is like a really delight feature, and it really increases the productivity of the people that use the app. So yeah, at least this guy thinks so. And then there are always people who live like the keyboard navigation lifestyle, and they really want you to support focus as well. So you should think about those people. And iPads, there is like a key difference between how iPad Focus works and how Focus works on tvOS, because on iPads there is a special thing like a tab key. So when you do use this tab key, right, this is the Apple News app, by the way. So how Focus moves is it moves between focus groups. So right now it's moving between the sidebar and the main screen. But when I use the arrow keys, it moves inside the focus group. So there are like really two levels of focus changes which actually don't exist on tvOS. tvOS is just in 4 directions and that's it. So yeah, just when you design user interfaces, like think about groups as well, and when they press tab keys, it needs to move between groups, and when they press the arrow key, it moves inside the group. So very interesting. If you want to try this, you can actually try it on a simulator. Just make sure you enable the full keyboard access setting in your accessibility, and then you can control your iPad simulator using your Mac keyboard. And yeah, it's really fun. If you want to test your apps, you could do that. And yeah, that's it. The code is available on GitHub if you want. Yeah, I would love to discuss any questions in the breaks if you have. And yeah, have a great rest of the conference.